Hello, everybody. I'm Katherine Lucero, and I am the Director of the Office of Youth and Community Restoration. Welcome to this event, which is a Youth Justice Action webinar series that is being put on by the Office of Youth and Community Restoration. I would like to thank Austin and other OYCR staff that have put this exciting event together today, and the staff of Rally, who is helping us with technology. I look forward to hearing today from our guest speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Butts, and from retired probation chief, Scott MacDonald, who will help facilitate and reflect a bit on positive youth justice and how this lens allows us to rise to the occasion of Senate Bill 823. OYCR is charged with leading and developing and envisioning what the state of California believes is a healthier California that enables all youth to be responsible, thriving, and engaged members of their community. Our mission is to promote trauma-responsive, culturally informed, gender-honoring, positive youth development services for young people involved in the juvenile justice system that supports youth success and transition into adulthood. The topic today, positive youth justice, helps us to level set and acknowledge that youth who are involved in the juvenile justice system are young people in a stage of human development, adolescence, and that this requires us to understand that our young people are young people. And if we can become educated on how to approach interventions in a positive youth development way, then we can help our young people be their best selves. I hope you will enjoy learning more about this topic as much as I have in my tenure here as the director of OYCR. And at this time, I am going to hand it over to the moderator and facilitator, Chief Scott MacDonald.
Thank you, Katherine. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Well, I want to start by giving a little bit of an introduction to Dr. Jeffrey Butts, which is not an easy task, given the breadth of his work in our field. Dr. Butts is a research professor and director of the Research and Evaluation Center at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, City University of New York, or known as CUNY. Previously, he was a research fellow with Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago, director of the program on youth justice at the Urban Institute of Washington, D.C., a senior research associate at the National Center for Juvenile Justice. He graduated from University of Oregon and earned a PhD from the University of Michigan. There's hardly a topic or hot button issue in juvenile justice that Dr. Butts hasn't written a number of books or publications about. His evaluation research has guided practitioners for many years on interventions related to safety, youth violence, guns, substance use, and strength-based practice, to name a few. He has also provided guidance to policymakers and leaders at state and local levels. I've had the pleasure of knowing Dr. Butts for over 2 decades. Can you believe that, Jeff? There's so much that he could talk about, but today we've asked him to focus on positive youth justice, a term that he and a few others coined based on positive youth development. As Director Lucero pointed out, the intent language of SB 823 calls for the implementation of approaches to support positive youth development. So this topic could not be more on point for us. I know many of you are implementing in some form or another positive youth development or positive youth justice in your own jurisdictions. But it's my observation, just in the work I've done nationally, that we could do a lot more. And we're hoping that this today's discussion will really get the juices flowing with regard to that. So before I turn over the presentation to Dr. Butts, we want to learn a couple things about who's in our audience. First, we want to get a sense of who's in the room So we're going to start with a poll. And please keep in mind that by your selection in this poll that I think we're going to bring up in a second, it will determine what breakout group you're in later. So please do take the poll. And in a second here, we'll show you the results to get a sense of who we have with us today. We're close to, looks like we're close to 90% complete. Please do take the poll again, or you'll be in a nomad's land later during breakouts. So great. So it looks like we have a lot of probation here. We have a number of youth advocates or community-based service providers. And we have a fairly large category of other. So is there anyone that would be able to put in the chat maybe what, if you were in the other group, what your affiliate is, your affiliation, or who you're with, or that would be great to know. So great. Next, we have one other thing we'd like you to do. So adolescence is the bridge between childhood and adulthood. It's a time of excitement, intense emotions, tumult, and growth. To ground us in today's topic, I want to start us out by reaching back in your memories and thinking about your own adolescence. And I'm going to put a word cloud up, and I'll give instructions in a second. But I want you to reach back to your adolescence and think of one word that describes, in one word, something that describes something that helped you through adolescence. So in one word, something that helped you through adolescence. So I'm going to pull up the word cloud now. And for those of you who have not done this before, there's a couple options. We're going to put a link in the chat. So if you want to answer this word cloud from your own screen, it will take you to a spot where you can enter a word, or you could, from your phone, you could use the QR code or the Menti code. Oh, folks are on it. They're on it. So, but the QR code, if you put that up, it will allow you in. We'll let it go a little bit here. Okay, looks like it's slowing down here. So we see friends, family, sports, parents, supports, mentors. I'm looking at the big words, but you look at a list like this, and we know that some of the youth we've worked with have had difficult times and added challenges than some of us. But a list like this are protective factors that helps everybody, right? And so when we think about our own adolescents or we think about our children, these are all the protections and connections that help a life move to adulthood successfully. I'm going to turn to Jeff now as the star of our show here. And maybe, Jeff, you'll want to speak to this, but I'm going to stop sharing that and let Jeff get to his presentation.
Okay. Well, it's great to be with everyone. And this was a very useful way to start. When people ask me how I got into this field, sometimes reporters ask that question. I usually, with a slight wink in my eye, I usually say my career started in the back of a police car. That as an adolescent, I and a couple of friends were doing something very unwise, trying to steal something, and ended up being in the back of the car and taken downtown. And it was the first time when my father showed up to pick us up, was the first time I was unable to make him smile. And that was more punishing to me than anything the police had said or done. But I remember then when my career started, I was an undergraduate in Eugene, and I was an intern at the juvenile court in Eugene. And I remember thinking, who designed this? The whole approach seemed to be to tell young people, you better behave or we'll come after you. And I thought, who came up with this as a theory of how to influence the behavior of an adolescent? That made no sense to me. And I always tell people that the most amazing thing about adolescents is they don't care what we think. And that both allows them to survive and grow and change society, and makes it really difficult when they're making mistakes and getting into trouble, because they don't listen to us as adults. So how do we tap into what they would listen to, what would shape behavior? And that's where this whole idea comes from. Okay, let me try to share my screen. All right, good.
Yep.
Thumbs up from Austin, that's good. And do you see the Zoom notes on my screen like I do? No, good, okay. I'm getting all the notices of people coming in the waiting room. All right, so we call this positive youth justice. A couple colleagues and I were reacting to, in the early part of this century, and even in the 90s, research started coming out that talked about adolescent development and positive youth development, and the concepts and the science behind it made a lot of sense, but it wasn't often translated for the justice environment. So a lot of psychologists were writing, and it seemed like they thought the audience were parents and teachers and people in what I would call privileged communities. And how do we take these lessons and all this knowledge coming out about positive youth development and adapt it for the world we were all working in, which was a challenge. So we wrote this report and published it, you can see, more than 10 years ago with the Coalition for Juvenile Justice, and tried to bridge those two worlds, from adolescent development, all the research coming out about adolescent development, and the worlds of practice and policy in the justice setting. And we came up with several things. The inspiration for this was the research that was coming out showing that youth with pro-social assets are less likely to be involved in risky behavior. And this concept of assets turned out to be pivotal. When people have things in their life which compel them and pull them into a positive adulthood, it's a lot easier to resist all the temptations and the impulses to misbehave as an adolescent. Those assets included a sense of belonging, a sense of attachment, and engagement with other people. And sometimes when law enforcement people tell me the problem with young people is they don't know the difference between right and wrong, I always say, oh, yes, they do. They've just embraced a very different concept of what you might mean by right and wrong, but they know exactly what behavior is tolerated and won't be tolerated within their social networks, their friendship networks, and their neighborhoods. So you have to pay attention to that and adapt to it, and not believe that everyone has lived the life you're living. Also, one of the biggest challenges is positive youth justice. To do it well, it's not a program which you can hire out or sign up a vendor to be a subcontractor to do the program. It's much more complicated than that. And that's what undermines a lot of efforts. When people embrace the idea of positive youth justice, they soon realize that it takes a lot of interaction with different sectors and organizations and bureaucracies. And you can't just have a vendor set up and do the program as if it were a therapeutic one-on-one program. And underlying all this is the insight that all youth need the same stuff that young people in wealthy communities have and take for granted. That is supportive relationships. And you came up with a lot of these in the word cloud. Being rewarded for work, being recognized for an effort and new skills. I always say I wish every young person every day had someone say to them, wow, how did you learn to do that? That's amazing. So being rewarded for work, success in learning, not just in the classroom, but in general. Also the ability to have physical activity. It's important for all of us, but during adolescence, it's critical for social development, physical development, and the ability to be involved in music and the arts, which I think is very important. And sometimes adults don't get that. Community and political involvement, to grow into having a role to play. And then the one that I think is most often ignored is excitement, fun, and adventure. If you're not ensuring that adolescents have that in their life, they will find it some other way. That's how I ended up in the back of the police car. That was fun and exciting to us. But you need to recognize that. And all these basic insights, I think, lead to this framework of positive youth justice. One of the challenges of positive youth justice is the fact that so much of the early research came out of neuroscience and people who write about neuroscience. And it's important to know this, that when you study brain functioning in adolescents, now we know we have research showing, as it says here, that adolescents tend to have poor self-control in an emotionally charged situation, or easily influenced by peer, and don't think the consequences of their actions. Any parents in the room who are surprised by this? I don't think so. Also, the research now shows that adolescence is characterized by rapid growth in the brain areas focused on pleasure seeking, and as it says, their emotional reactivity. So it doesn't take much to prompt a reaction, and you all know that too. With slower development in the areas that govern self-control and judgment. Again, the only response is, duh. It's nice to have real credible research that shows this, but obviously this is now accepted judgment. And this is probably one of the more important ones, that with neuroscience research, they found that adversity and stress in the environment tends to downregulate, suppress the part of the brain that allows for adaptive behavior, and upregulate, overstimulate emotional systems that are important for guiding judgment and decision-making. So it's no surprise when you look at crime rates, arrest rates, that everything is increasing during the teenage years, peaks in the mid-20s, and then starts to decline, which is the exact graph you would have for intellectual development, neurological development, and it lines up perfectly with the crime rate and the number of people picked up for various offenses. So why are we shocked? So understanding brain and neuroscience did turn out to be critical for understanding and influencing adolescent behavior. But the downside or the danger is too many policymakers and practitioners too, when they heard this, assumed that criminal activity, law breaking, violating the rules as an adolescent was somehow about their brains. And people actually thought they were on the side of goodness and truth when they would talk about adolescent brains and decision making. And that started to govern the response of the justice system, which I would advise is a serious misstep, to think that you don't turn to the neurological science to create your justice system. But that was actually happening a lot during the 90s into, I would say, until we wrote this report. About that time, that's what we were reacting to, that too many people were just hearing brain science or neurology and assuming they had the secret to running a good justice system. And addressing substance abuse and mental health are certainly important for some young people and some families, but it's not sufficient for having a good, well-rounded justice system. And I'll show you what I mean. So we now have lots of research showing this. 20 years ago, Linda Teplin did a study looking at high quality mental health diagnostics in a detention center and found her number was 69%. I've seen it go as high as 80. In a locked facility detention center, that's the prevalence of diagnosable mental health and substance use disorders. So again, the policymakers who don't think deeply about these things thought, oh, now we have the answer. That's why they're all in there, because they have mental health disorders. And here's why it's a mistake. They forget the fact that in the general population, the prevalence of mental health disorders is 20%. So any kid anywhere in America, about 1 in 5, are going to have something diagnosable from mild depression on through more serious things. Then you go a little deeper into probation intake, which is after processing and so forth, after adjudication, and you're about half. And if you go to the front door of the justice system, they don't do screening literally at the front door, but if you go to data from this juvenile assessment center study, it's about 29%. So you notice it's stepping up there. As you go deeper into the justice system, the justice process, young people show up with more and more diagnosable disorders. So what are we to infer from that? The same thing is true when you look at drug problems. So youth at that juvenile assessment center have a overall rate in that study of about 11%. So the front door of the justice system, barely past law enforcement, referred first time to begin a process, about 11%. But it's 8% in the general population, this diagnosable substance abuse disorder. Let's go deeper in the system, past the intake assessment onto being referred to probation. Using national data, we know roughly about half of all youth referred to the court end up going to some kind of probation service. So I made that bar half as big. What's the prevalence of substance use disorders among the probation population? And you get 25%. You go a little deeper into the system, past probation, into youth being held in a secure detention center. We know from national data about 1 in 5 cases of young people referred from law enforcement end up in detention. So I made that bar 1/5 the size of the first bar. What proportion of those have diagnosable substance use disorders? And using the Teplin study, we know it's about half. So what do we see here? Are these the same kids? So are we seeing evidence that substance use causes juvenile crime? Or are we seeing that the justice process tends to sort and sift and hold on to the kids with mental health and substance use disorder, which is perfectly appropriate if you have the resources to help young people and families with substance use and mental health disorders, but it's not a way to infer the causation of youth delinquency, youth law violations. And that's what was happening a lot around the country, where you quote these numbers. And I hear practitioners do this all the time. We know 80% of kids in the system have diagnosable mental health and substance use disorders. But the system, of course, is never defined. It often comes from studies of confined populations. So when you go into the deep end and some researcher does a screening of diagnosable disorders in the deep end, you'll find these high numbers. And then the politicians assume they've just learned something about causation, and they've learned why people are in the system. And it's because they have diagnosable disorders, which causes all the funding to flow into clinical models, cognitive behavioral therapy, family therapy, all the clinical stuff, because they think it's mental health, neurology, and substance abuse. And yes, those things are important. They're important tools in the toolbox, but that is not the answer for why we have so many kids being picked up by police and getting into trouble. You're not going to solve the problem just maximizing drug treatment and mental health treatment. And that gets tricky. So we have to think this through and think about the consequences for policy and for practice, and keep in mind that we need something other than mental health and substance abuse. And that's often harder than we think. So key questions, key elements are, how do we transform youth justice to focus on practical ways of facilitating what we know about youth development? attaching young people to positive assets and relationships? How do we create public-private partnerships? Because you cannot do what you need to do with all public agencies. So you need private contractors, you need partners, and that makes it more complicated and riskier and more bureaucratic. But you cannot just assign this, as you all know, to one big state agency who handles everything. That one big state agency should manage everything and keep on top of everything, but you need local government and you need private agencies as partners to do what is called for in a positive youth justice world. And then for my part of the world, my part of the system, I focus on the evidence that this is effective, because I know if we don't prove that these things actually help, the whole system will fall back on old ways of thinking. And the more recent old way of thinking is everyone needs psychotherapy. The old way of thinking before that, of course, which is still around, is that we need more confinement and more locked spaces and facilities because these kids got to learn their lesson. And boy, there's nothing like sending them away from their families and locking them up. And if you don't prove that the good model works, we'll still end up with bad model. And so I think research has an important role to play here. So when we tried to summarize what positive youth justice was, we came up with these things, these two dimensions. The key assets are learning and doing, so skill development, learning how to do new things, being recognized for that, and attaching and belonging. Having people care about you, knowing you're part of the group, being recognized as being part of the group. This street crews know this. They know these two things are what you need to run an effective street crew. We should at least be as smart as they are and focus on the things that actually draw young people into positive futures. And then each of those things need to be done within these core dimensions. We labeled as work, education, relationships, community, health, and creativity. And that can be hard to do. One short story, I was visiting, I won't tell you who, but I was visiting a large private provider of residential treatment, and they told me how they were really building up their music program. And I thought, oh, that's fabulous. Music's very important to me. My parents were both music teachers. It really helped me through adolescence. I said, that's fabulous. Can I see it? So they take me into this room where I see these 40 or 50 predominantly youth of color standing on bleachers in front of their teacher, who was someone who looks like me, at least I do now. So 40 or 50 people, young people of color, standing there being what I would call forced to sing some old Bing Crosby Christmas carol. And I thought, you don't get it. That's not what music and expression is about. It's not about forcing them to embrace your culture. It's about having them express themselves. So that was frustrating. So it's easy for all these things to be misinterpreted and misused, but those are the core components we came up with. The other thing we noticed is it's hard in systems to adapt if they hold on to their old views of youth. So we wrote this is one image in that report, which just says how people see young people, how even policymakers and practitioners in the justice system, how they see young people. And it's viewing them as a resource is a radical idea, because the two primary ways in the justice system that young people are usually viewed is one of those first two columns. And the people who see kids as victims think they're on the side of goodness, and the ones who see kids as villains think they're on the side of goodness because they're protecting the community. But you got to break out of both of those and shift into seeing young people as capable of transforming our communities and becoming leaders and helping them develop the potential to do that, which is what positive youth justice should be. So lastly, this is the challenges are, how do we do this? How do we focus on assets in relationships when most of the data we have come from police, where we have our arrests, prosecutions? You can't run this system with just police data. How do we do this with multiple partners from multiple sectors, health, labor, education, housing? How do we do that? And that's complicated. Also, all those agencies must collaborate in collecting the data that we need as researchers to show that these things actually do result in positive futures for young people. Because if you don't prove it, again, people won't do it. People will fall back on the old ways of thinking. Politicians get rewarded for all those old ways, and all they care about is who votes for them. So it's really a challenge to prove that they need to break out of that and do something more positive. So multi-agency systems. And lastly, we did one more report, came out a few years ago, trying to lay out some of this and helping point the way for systems looking to follow this approach. And it's on the website of my research center, but that bit.ly, that short link there will take you there. I think that is it. Yep. So I'll hand it back to Scott.
Great, thank you, Dr. Butts. Okay, so I'm going to take a few minutes here to ask you some hardball questions, and then we'll turn to the folks in the audience. If you want to put questions in the chat, we can also take some of those. So I want to start with this, Dr. Butts. We often talk about accountability. And how does a youth development approach or positive youth development, positive youth justice promote accountability? How can it promote accountability? And how can it attend to the needs of victims? How do we do that?
Well, I think you have to attend to both of those. And I think if I could show you, if I had a nice report right now showing you that this county implemented positive youth justice in full, and here are the results. And I could show you, here's the proportion of people who had finished high school by the age of 18 or even 20. And that number climbs. If I could show you the proportion who were working full time by the time they were 25, had graduated from college or some kind of other training program by the time they were 25. And I showed you that graph and it was going up. And then I showed you a graph showing how many people were living in their own home and raising a family by the age of 28. And that graph also went up. You would start to think I had found something useful. Even when you hear a story of one case where someone was harmed by a 16-year-old, you would have all those graphs in the back of your mind and think, no, I understand that's horrible that happened. But we have to hold on to this model because it's making the whole community healthier and safer. And you would try to incorporate those. What happens right now when someone tells that one story about a horrible case is that all these good ideas just get tossed aside and we run back to the 1800s and start talking about having more bed space. And so I do think, and it's self-serving perhaps because I'm a researcher, but I do think if we build the evidence over time that's persuasive and has a story behind it, people would listen to it and not be so eager to throw over the good ideas for the old.
Thank you for that. And so how, right now, as you're aware, California is in a realignment stage, and a lot of young people who were formerly at the Department of Juvenile Justice are now at the local level. And there's youth with high needs, histories of trauma, and with serious offenses, sometimes violence. How is positive youth justice a good approach for youth with high needs and those issues?
So as I showed you the data, when you are in the deep end, you're going to have more mental health issues, more substance use issues. You do need to provide those restorative clinical approaches. But that doesn't mean when someone leaves a facility at age 19 or 20 or something, that now that they've had treatment for mental health and substance abuse, they're ready to go. They still have to have a way to plug into society, a way of feeling belonging, skill development. All those things are still relevant. We delude ourselves into thinking we're protecting the public safety if we just deal with their more serious clinical problems, even trauma. Trauma is essential to deal with, but it's not an explanation of why one young person ends up in a locked room and another does not. It's a risk factor, but you cannot put a young person on a path to successful adulthood just by addressing their risk factors.
Okay, so kind of related to that, when we think about attaching and belonging, I think about young people having opportunities and connections and support in pro-social ways in community. But for a lot of young people in this, and for practitioners on this call, we're serving youth who are in custody, sometimes for longer periods of time. And so want to hear your thoughts about how do you set the stage? How do you provide positive youth justice within facilities, and how should we think about setting the stage for reentry and continuing that into community? So any thoughts along those lines would be great.
Sure. And I'm tempted to turn my camera off and back on because I seem to be going out of focus, but I think, and I have never worked in the deep end, so I should say that I've never been full-time in a facility of committed young people. But I think if we did an honest tour or look at what a young person's day-to-day life is in a facility, it's mostly about compliance, obedience, and keeping your head down and not being noticed as much as possible. I have been to some facilities that focus on positive engagement. And I was once at a place, there was actually another private facility that organized young people into learning how to work on bicycles, and then took them on like a backcountry rural bicycle tour. And boy, just watching the motivation and seeing how young people responded to that was revolutionary. So if locked facilities could be more than sit down, shut up, and do what we tell you, and instead, do you know how to do this? Would you like to know how to do this? Let's work on that together as a group and build skills and activities that get them to collaborate with one another so they believe or start to experience the fact they're part of that group. I think that would be helpful. So just because you're in a locked facility doesn't mean these ideas are irrelevant. You just have to balance them with all the other concerns about security and safety, dealing with trauma, everything else.
Great. A couple more questions, and then there's really good stuff in the chat that I'm going to try to scan through and lift up some questions there as well. But what type of partnerships are necessary to make PYJ work in a robust fashion?
Yeah. Well, again, I think about this in terms of evidence and proving that it's effective, which means if you don't have access to school records, you're not going to be able to do anything about intellectual performance. And in a locked facility, you can do that because you are the school in many places. But in the broader community, you need access to school attendance and performance, even grades. And it's really hard to work with local school systems to share information. But that graph I described earlier, showing by the time they're 18, they've finished high school, that would be a wonderful thing to have. And you cannot do it just by doing surveys and follow-up contacts. You need the bureaucracies to tie together. You also need schools to recognize that just because someone's justice involved doesn't mean they're a lost cause and you stick them in a room and tell them to be quiet. It means they're more challenging for the teachers, but that challenge is worthwhile to put in more energy for that young person in the classroom. Same thing with work. So again, we want people to have the ability to be independent and be able to work and have a job by the time they're in their 20s. And to do that and to show that you did it, you need to have whatever the state agency or local agency that monitors and stores all those labor force records tied in with criminal justice records so you can establish that. And again, that's really hard. And it's not hard in every country, by the way. I was talking to a colleague from Denmark who told me in that country, once you have their ID number, you can tie all these data sets together and prove anything. And at first I thought that was a great idea. And then I remembered who our policymakers are. And I thought I would not want our governments to have that ability to tie all those records together. So that means you'd have to have a wall between the research community and the government where you would get the records, tie them together to be able to prove the impact of all these efforts. But then you wouldn't want your state department to harvest all that information and have those records to go after people with. So it gets trickier in our setting.
Okay, finally, and a question that's probably music to your ears as a researcher and evaluator, how do we know that PYJ is working? Has it been operationalized to the extent it should? Do we have the tools to evaluate it? Should we be moving more in that direction? How do we know it's working?
Yeah, I would not use working. I would not use that verb. I wouldn't say a lot. A number of jurisdictions have embraced these concepts and are pursuing them, but no one, I think, yet has put together it's an integrated program of policy and practice reform with research to show that it works. Mostly people respond just like I did, that this makes so much sense. This is what we should be doing. And it's really hard to fight the market dominance of the clinical field. And I don't begrudge them their market dominance, because and this gets into a little bit of research talk, but one of the reasons why the clinical field has more powerful outcomes and can tell a policymaker they're effective is that they measure things on a one-to-one basis. So they have a treatment program, 30 kids come into the treatment program, they deliver the program, they know they are because they can see it, and then they follow up those 30 kids and see how many get rearrested. What you do with that kind of research is not find the holy grail of public safety, but you do find a measurable improvement. And so people can report back, we have statistically significant results, and then all the state legislators say, great, fabulous, here's more money. And that's because they're measuring one-to-one change. And I don't think anyone who's worked in the justice system very long thinks that's the all-time, all-purpose solution to public safety, is dealing with people on a one-to-one basis, because we have to deal with the environments and the community context that young people are living in and their families are living in, because all those stressor and inequities and good old-fashioned American racism contributes to all the problems that result in youth behavior problems. And you can't pretend that you'll just fix that problem by waiting until a young person's in trouble and then providing them with a therapeutic model and everything's fine, because there are more coming, because that neighborhood is hell to live in, and we know that. But our policymakers refuse to fix neighborhoods or deal with social and racial inequities in this country, so we just keep repopulating the system. And if you think that way, as I do, it's easy to get just broken down by pessimism, and you can't go anywhere because it just seems like it's never going to be fixable. But I think the positive youth justice model, if we could show those policymakers that we made a difference, maybe they would be more supportive and start to build in those resources and those assets for young people, instead of just thinking about trauma, mental health, and substance use.
Great, thank you. So I want to sort of invite people to chime in with questions. Austin, what's the way we can do this? I know this is a large call. Should they raise their hand to do that?
There are lots of questions in the chat. Maybe we can go over some of those. Would you like me to read them, or did you want to read them?
Well, I do have one ready to go that we could start with, and then maybe we could add to the chat also if people want to speak up, we could do that as well. So I don't know if this is a statement or a question, but I'll start this one from, is it Cruz? And Jeff, you have access to this as well, but thank you for your presentation. Who are your Brown, Black, Indigenous partners steeped in cultural transformation and restorative justice work to guide the way? And so I know that you're not based in California per se, but I think this is obviously a very, very important question. The last snapshot I looked at of the DJJ population when it was still in place, it was 92% youth of color, predominantly brown youth, Latino boys. And so can you speak to the importance of PYJ with a cultural specificity or the importance of culture and I think
Sure.
that's and maybe as also restorative justice and how that dovetails or not with PYJ.
Right. So there's some good news here that due to the cultural milieu we're all living in, there's a lot more funding sources that are focused on this issue. And because of that, you can now you can have a nonprofit organization that focuses on that and actually be able to support yourself with foundation grants, and that's becoming more successful. Also, the federal government in the past 3 years has invested a lot of money into what they call CVI, or community violence intervention. that has helped to seed a lot of these organizations. So, and the ones that occur to me first are things like Cities United. I'm very familiar with the violence prevention field right now. And so a lot of the models that are allied with the Cure Violence model or Advanced Peace, they're getting resources, they're doing this work. So that is important. I think there's a risk, though, in that, like anything to do with government investment or foundations too, the investment sometimes follows effective slogans and rhetoric and not so much practices and policy. And I have seen examples where the White House, for example, announces something and calls it an evidence-based program. And I know it's not what a researcher would call evidence-based. We would call it promising, important, valuable, worthy of future investment. But there's a rush to call things evidence-based just because they sound right. And again, I still worry about, there's always got to be the Heritage Foundation and Manhattan Institute, people just waiting to attack anything that sounds progressive. And if you start talking about communities of color and justice and community strengthening, that sounds progressive, and those groups are ready to undermine it by looking at this, at whatever you have to support it and finding the errors in the research interpretation. And the field's loaded with bad research. And so it takes some skill to see through that and prepare for those reactions. So it is to say there's a growing community working on this. Another one is the, what's it called, David Mohammed's group, National Institute of Criminal Justice Reform. So there are places that are growing and having an influence, but we need to work in partnership. If they go too far without paying attention to the need for solid evidence, they are at risk. And I don't want to see them hurt in the public debate over this issue. I want them to be prepared for the backlash that often comes.
Okay, well, we have a fair amount of time, so I'm just going to work through some of the questions. And one of the early questions in, or maybe a statement to a certain extent, was I'll speak to. Sometimes detainment is needed to get the help they need, but the issue is that the juvenile system right now is not working. Have no halls available except one, and that one is so understaffed that it is creating a very dangerous situation for the kids and staff here. So a lot of challenges noted here right now in this moment. We are moving too slow to address this issue at this present moment. Although substance abuse and mental health are greatly impact our youth, you are forgetting those involved in gangs, foster care, or in poverty. And wonder if you might want to speak to that. I mean, one of the things that I've often felt is that positive youth development, positive youth justice, opportunities, belonging, and attaching is exactly to me, the antidote for as a gang alternative, or sort of recognizing the underlying need that a young person is trying to meet through a maladaptive, approach of gang involvement. But there's a lot there in that statement, and I think this is a challenging time to implement these things. So I don't know if you have the answers, but I do want to make sure we're giving time to recognize those challenges that a lot of people on this call are grappling with. Yeah,
it is a good question. And the analogy to foster care, I think, is right on point. After I worked in the juvenile court for a year in Eugene, I got an MSW in Portland and worked for the State Child Welfare Authority in Portland and was a foster care worker, which was both educational and horrifying. And I think it is exactly parallel to the question about secure facilities and young people. Because I was young and enthusiastic, and I thought my role was to keep kids at home, get them out of foster care if they're in, restore the family, support the family. But I also knew that my enthusiasm for that could end up hurting someone, because at some point you have to recognize the horrible reality that this 2-year-old is not safe here and have the court remove them. Now, that whole system is, of course, more likely to go for removal with families of color and poor families. And that is an obvious parallel to juvenile justice, youth justice. But it doesn't mean that you sacrifice the 2-year-old on your, your altar of equity and inclusion. You have to pay attention to the dangers that in again, a overstressed, under-resourced community, people are going to get hurt. And sometimes in the youth justice system, it's unwanted. You try to avoid it, but sometimes secure confinement is necessary. If we all had complete trust in the decision-making process to decide who goes into secure confinement and who doesn't, this wouldn't be as much of a problem. But we can all see, I mean, if you work in the system for any time at all, you see immediately all the flaws in the unprofessionalism and resource deprivation in the system. And you realize everyone's dealing with a crisis every day and maybe doing the best they can, but that's why you end up with kids going into locked facilities. And somehow that has to be balanced against public safety. And it's a constant challenge and a constant stress. So there's no easy answer. And I think recognizing the two sources of harm are important, and you just constantly try to balance.
So I'm going to take us to sort of the other end of the continuum and go upstream to diversion. There's a question here about diversion, like what do good diversion programs consist of? And we, I've been reading a lot of the research that shows that diversion is a very effective and it's a front of the system intervention that tends to be underutilized. I saw in reading your CV that you had done some work. There's a lot of places that I'm working right now are really concerned with gun violence. I saw that you evaluated a gun diversion program. So I want to also note that it's not just necessarily cases that we think are nickel and dime or very easy to handle, but can you speak to what a good diversion program consists of? And yeah, that's kind of the question.
Yeah, I also wrote an article I think I wrote it with a friend, called Critical Diversion. And it's on my website, and I break copyright law all the time by just putting stuff on my website. So if you go there, jeffreybutts.net, you can get that article called Critical Diversion. And diversion often is a label used for a lot of different things. And it just means this young person was capable of being pushed further into the system, and we decided not to do that and instead do something else. So there could be diversion from arrest, there could be diversion from prosecution, from placement, from adjudication. So it's a very broad thing. But probably the way most people think about it is a young person at risk of out-of-home placement or at risk of severe disposition, whatever it is, and instead we do something informal or withhold adjudication pending completion of a program, that kind of diversion. And I think it's just an empirical question that you can show that if it's managed right, that the community gets really no further benefit from the more severe sanctions, especially placement, than it would from a well-crafted, well-managed, consistent diversion program. But you don't use diversion as a statement of rhetoric and goodness, and then label anything diversion as if people are going to sign up for it. You got to show that it's actually doing something productive. And I always end up talking about research. I guess that's how I ended up in this career. But I want the community to win, but I also know that we're really up against it, and it's gotten so much worse in the past few years that you can't just claim to have the best idea and all the policymakers come along and say, good for you, let's do that. They need to be basically hit over the head with enough evidence that they can't avoid it anymore. And even then, some of them will still deny that it ever happened, but still we have to focus on the real world.
Great, thank you. I'm looking through, there's actually quite a bit here. I was looking for specific partners who are guiding your research work. You have an incredible platform. Without the right partners, the vision and practice is limited. Not sure if there's a question in there. Let's see. What else? But you might want to speak to that.
Yeah, I work with lots of people. If you go to the website and look at publications, I hardly write anything by myself. So mostly they're partners, academic, practitioners, and you are much better off as a researcher working with people who are really focused on their own communities and trying to make things better, because that's where the good ideas come from. But you can't just you can't just assert the good idea without backing it up with some credible evidence to show the skeptics that it makes a difference. But yeah, partners and neighborhood organizations, community groups are essential partners.
What special training should teachers working with kids, young people in detention have? And where can those teachers get that? And I'm assuming this is with regard to positive youth justice. And I'll mention one other comment that came in related, where someone had just mentioned that they like the framework of youth as a resource. That's a great matrix that you kind of showed up. And I do encourage people to read the PYJ document, because I think it really does shift the lens on how we view young people. But maybe you could speak to how teachers could support.
This is not something I know a lot about. So, I mean, like a lot of us, I usually have lessons I've learned by watching things go badly. But the training and resources and backup needed for effective classroom instruction, I assume that's what that means. I wish it was part of the way educators were assessed, that can they reach the full spectrum of students they encounter and adapt their strategies for different students from different communities. I'm not sure, so I really can't go deeply into that.
Scott, I'd like to note that we do have Dr. Michael Massa on the OYCR staff, and he is a PhD in special education with an expertise in court schools and schools that serve justice-involved youth. And I'm going to put his email in the chat so that our very large group of educators who've joined us today can certainly reach out to him.
And knowing Dr. Massa, I know he comes from the lens of seeing young people as a resource, and so feel free to speak to that if you wish on this call. And any other looking through, is there anything else or that we could sort of lift up from this? And Jeff, feel free to check the chat as well. I think we've hit a lot of these.
If you want to go to hands, do we have time to go to hands?
Yeah, and if I didn't hit your comment or question, or you have more, let's get some hands. Here we have Nazli. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah, Nazli Restrepo. Thank you so much. Actually, there was a question from Rebecca Acevo that I thumbs up, because I would love to hear about that. Her question was, as a CBO, what's the best way to hold public agencies accountable for their commitment to PYJ?
Great,
Boy.
thank you for that.
Yeah. I've been working a lot with New York City government the last 5 years or so, and I would think I've learned a lot of lessons about how hard it is to hold public agencies accountable. I think challenging them in the open is probably not very effective. Working with them as a partner and trying to help solve problems before they're exposed to public scrutiny is what would probably make you a valuable partner and have more influence. And I try to do that. If you're a CBO and if you're not currently receiving funding from a public agency, maybe you can be a little more aggressive. But it's a very delicate thing, because a lot of public funds through those public organizations flow through those organizations, and community-based organizations are somewhat dependent on government contracts and grants. So it's just like any field, funder has a lot of influence, and funders like to look like they're doing the right thing and be taken seriously. And if you help them avoid problems, not on stage, but backstage, I think that's what I usually try to do. I don't know if that's me being timid or if that is actually a smart way to do it.
I see that Kate English has raised her hand, has a question.
Yeah, and just to briefly touch on that last question, I was a member of the Juvenile Justice Commission in my county for a long time, and it functions as an oversight body for juvenile justice. So I agree that those relationships, we always had a good relationship with probation, and we could come to them when we had a concern and they would listen and adjust. But I think that those commissions exist in every county. So if you're having an egregious situation, I think you should go to your partners that have teeth, so to speak, and can call those people into those conversations pointedly. But my question that was in the chat is about youth engagement. I'm a firm believer, and here, let me just camera on. I'm a firm believer that youth engagement is a is a necessary at this point. And what I mean by youth engagement is something a little more than like talking to them once in a while, right? Their voices need to be impacting the systems that like they should be in these conversations with us right now. And I've seen that there's really ineffective ways of doing that. I've been trying to do it for my whole career, and I've done it really ineffective way, and so what are some of the most meaningful models you've seen for youth engagement that doesn't look like tokenizing youth, that doesn't look like condescending to youth, that doesn't look like planning meetings when youth aren't available, that doesn't look like pulling youth into conversations where their voices are being just sort of tokenized into those spaces? I've seen it. I mean, there's even some great policy out there, but it seems to fall apart in practice all the time.
Great question.
Yeah, and I can't say, oh, here's the answer and here's what you need to do. But I totally agree that that is a critical challenge. And when I've seen effective programming, it's often because they have standing youth advisory groups who are in the meetings and making decisions, and also providing opportunities for young people to be engaged in things that they enjoy doing. So I used the horrible story of the kids being forced to sing old Christmas carols. I also visited a facility once where they started talking to me about their musical program, and I was skeptical because of this other experience. And then I walk in and they have built 2 soundproof booths where young people can go in and have a range of mixes they can pull from, and they could do their own beats with electronic, it had all the computer stuff you need to make a track. And just watching these 15-year-olds just feel so engaged by this and making a track that then the other young people in the unit would later hear, you could just see that it had changed their whole perspective on things. And then you take that energy, instead of making a music track, maybe you think about how should we organize time off the unit, or how should we make our recreation time better? And suddenly they become a self-governing enterprise. That's how we expect to be treated as adults. So like, why do we assume that they're willing to just to be told what to do all day and not feel part of something? So I think all those ideas, it's just really easy for them to fall apart. Another story is I was once invited out to the Police Athletic League here in New York City to go see what they were doing. And they told me that the summer program for justice-involved young people involved an indoor basketball court. And I thought, oh, that's terrific. It was a hot summer. They had an indoor court with air conditioning. I thought this would be perfect. And then I got there and realized they weren't making sure that everyone had an opportunity to play basketball. They were using basketball as a reward and removing it for failure to obey the program director and fail to do what they're suspected. It was used to sanction people, which means as soon as the young people figured that out, they became anti-basketball, which was just ignorant. But it's what often happens. So it's having one good idea is not sufficient. You have to stay with it. And someone with the perception that this question reveals should stick with the policymakers and the program directors and continue to remind people of what the overall mission is supposed to be.
That's great. So Dan Sackheim, I think, has
Sackheim.
hand up. Okay.
A few points, and I'm coming perspective. I work with the California Department of Ed in this. One, I've opened so many of the conferences are former youth gathering to talk about youth. I've actually opened conference with a keynote of a panel of marginalized youth, and it's called Listen to the Wisdom of Youth about what supports or undermines their resilience and their success. And it changed the whole character of the conference. So I think that we don't, the idea of seeing youth as resources, but then we gather without them to talk about them in our practice. Point two is I get calls about kids who are in trouble. And what I always want to explore is we've had the restorative line, you're not the problem is the problem. But I want to first start out with respect by asking, is there a goal, a value, a challenge, pain that's being expressed in a way that may be problematic to self and others, instead of talking about the problem as the focus, but it's just not on you. I'm not blaming you, but I'm still talking about the problem. And third, I get calls and, I'm in trouble. I've been involved in a fight. Now I'm being suspended. I was attacked. But I ask it, have you ever been taught alternatives? Using a command voice, stepping back, telling the other to order them back, order someone to get help, or in using drugs. Do we teach them there are ways to be safe in getting high, running, singing, dancing? I had one girl say drum circles, which I love. We don't teach that. And my answer to all of them is, could you step up in your school or your expulsion panel? So if you let me stay, I will lead these efforts that you have failed to bring to us. And that strength and ownership of caring for others. So it's not only to, see them as resources in a limited, but do we encourage and we teach them these alternatives, or it's only after they haven't succeeded? My 3 points, but you call it a question. Go for it. Thank you. I'm a little passionate about this over the many decades.
So, Jeff, did you want to add anything? I mean, I think the one of the real major point he's made is right on, is that this has to be youth led to a certain extent and youth engaged, and that we have to do more than just see youth as a resource. We have to fully engage them as a partner in the process, right? And hear what their needs are, what they're interested in. So maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, I could see having two paths. It's also important to have the ability to focus on a problem-solving discussion that relates to practices and policy with just the people who are in a position to actually create and manage those practices and policies. That if young people, or even I could say people from the community, are involved in every conversation, the pace of the problem solving is going to be slowed down. And maybe that's inappropriate to say, but just imagine if the conversation was something very technical and you had a random sample of people from the neighborhood offering their own opinions. It would end up, the people who were in a position to actually come up with a solution would end up meeting afterwards at the cafe down the street or something. So you have to recognize there are conversations which become too complicated, too technical for really broad participation. But if you only do those, then you don't know what the neighbors are thinking, then you don't know what young people are thinking, you miss. So both things can end up being tunnels from which you can't see the outside world. But I think recognizing the validity of both pathways is important. And I've just been in too many meetings that were designed to be community input. And you could just see, the next time you're not going to get, the commissioner's not going to come back and the judge is not going to show up, and you just lose the policy relevance if you focus too much on the community input. But vice versa, if it's all police chiefs and commissioners and judges talking, the neighborhood's not going to come back because they realize they're just being tokenized. So recognizing the validity of both, managing the validity of both, and integrating them at some point, I think, is the key.
So, Jeff, I'm going to take the liberty of kind of sharing a story back sort of from my work as a former probation chief or probation officer that I think sort of embodied positive youth justice. And there was a comment around the intersect with restorative justice, and I think this story sort of embodies that as well, and some of the comments of the last speaker before you, and that was around just engaging youth and how we do that without tokenizing that, and how we create spaces, make spaces for positive youth justice to actually happen. And one thing that sort of I realized as a chief is if I could really encourage and allow my staff to bring their passion to work, whatever that is, for me, it was chess. For others, it was other things, as a way to engage the young people that they're working with, to create some space to do that. And going back many years at a time, it was around the time of the super predator that we were concerned about and the kind of tough on crime era. There was a lot of focus in California and in my jurisdiction around gangs. And we sort of had a habit back then of telling kids what not to have, what colors not to wear, what not to do. And then we'd sort of go out and find them doing the things that we're telling them not to do. And way back then, young people, it doesn't happen so much today, I don't think, but they would end up in juvenile detention for those things. And it occurred to me that rather than trying to do that heavy resource activity, one youth at a time, that maybe we should try to engage young people in more positive activities, and that a probation's role could actually be doing that. And so we had a probation officer, actually a couple, who started soccer programs for youth who are deep in our system, that heroin involved, some with violence issues, on opposing gangs, Norteño, Sereno gangs at the time. And we created a soccer team that was purple called Azteca Soccer. And the young people excelled, won the league a couple years in a row. And it was kind of an interesting journey to see that take root, because it was a lot of work. But I always thought of it as, here's 14 kids gathered together doing something positive with their parents cheering in the sidelines. And over time, we developed a summer program where we partnered with the schools that had some jobs money for the summer. And we had these older kids forming soccer teams for the younger kids in their own community, where there weren't a lot of resources in the summer. So they were kind of put in this position as role models, teaching soccer to the younger people in their own community. And a portion of their earnings went to restitution. This is sort of from kind of the old balance and restorative justice approach, where there was actually a victim component put into this. That program still exists today, but I saw it as a true sort of possibility and potential to kind of shift the role of probation into embracing more of these things. And it's something that probation couldn't do alone. We had to have a lot of partnership and a lot of community involvement to do that, including the parents and the young people. And it was culturally relevant. This was in Watsonville, California, predominantly, where there were mostly Latino youth. And so, I just wanted to sort of share that a little bit as we sort of move into this next piece, as one example of how I think positive youth justice can live within the system. And so with that, I was actually thinking this would be a good time for us all to break out based on the polls and the discipline that you chose at the beginning of this. We want to have some breakout groups. There will be facilitators in those breakout groups. And we want to ask you a couple questions to consider. And now I've got to find my questions. Where did I put them? We want you to think about, within your role, thinking about your role, in what ways could you promote positive youth justice? Maybe it's happening already. How could that be expanded? What can you do in your role to promote positive youth justice? So think about that, whether you're a judge, whether you're an attorney, how can you promote it in your capacity? And then as a sort of second question, what would you need to do that? What are things that you would be helpful to support you in doing that? So, you know, what we thought we'd do here is just maybe starting with the facilitators of each group, just maybe mentioning one or two things that you discussed, and just do that. We could just do it popcorn style, whoever wants to go first. And others could speak up as well if you want to add that, but we have a few minutes to do that. So anyone want to start?
I'll go ahead and start. This is Miguel Garcia. I help facilitate the community advocacy, youth advocate, and community group. I'll go ahead and start off with our last comment. I think it was revolving around the self-esteem of a young person. We want to promote positive youth justice. We have to see where the young person's at and how they are with their emotions. That's essentially one comment. But another was that the practice of youth advisory councils, creative arts programs, getting young people's feedback is essential to implementing programming for young people inside the facilities, but also when wanting to see change for the young people, listening to them is important. So we definitely got a lot of activities for the young people the activities that a young person should be getting involved is essential for their positive youth development, but also it will promote positive youth justice. So I'll just stop there. Hear others.
Great. Well, I'll go quick first. The probation group, we had a great conversation. There was just, first off, I had to sort of recognize there's a lot going on in counties already. So we had Madera talk about some things they were doing, Sonoma, San Diego, Fresno. I think there were others. You know, a couple ideas was ensuring that PYJ types of thinking and programming was incorporated into case plans. I heard giving staff an opportunity to really engage and participate, giving them some leeway to do that. And I also heard the value of tapping into the volunteer base into communities and really making sure that we have a connection to community. There was some discussion about credible messengers and the need to sort of do more of that. We had a request to actually get some more support around that. San Diego's doing some work in that area. And so Karen Pank and our office, OYCR, in our discussion sort of agreed that we kind of work together around also trying to find opportunities to support that effort at the county level. So that was more than one thing. Who else would follow me now? It's another group.
I can go next. So I was in the other. It's funny to be called other, but what we found was that actually there was quite a grouping of individuals from education, court, schools, and their associations with all the other types of organizations such as, let's see, Rising Scholars. We had Callie there, Dr. Massa was there, so on. So the one thing that I want to share is certainly Rising Scholars and the work that they're doing across the state. We had Callie be able to respond to that and share with us what is happening there. But the piece that was important to me that kind of highlighted was this notion of assuring that young people can get paid, or the capacity to get paid if they are sitting in a facility and they want to be able to help others in their connectivity to how to get engaged, not only in school, but higher ed, whether it's community college, and getting all of their things straightened out, sorted out, so that they can not only be dually enrolled, both in getting their GED, but also in community college and all the different programs. So that's one thing that stood out for me, that maybe not all facilities realize that there are funding for young people to be paid to be sort of the credible messengers while being inside. So I'll stop there.
Oh, that's great. And that reminds me also of one thing about that I didn't say about credible messengers. We are on a future webinar going to ask Clinton Lacey, who runs CM3, the Credible Messenger and Mentoring Movement, to speak to us. So do keep track of these webinar opportunities. We do want to try to address the hot button issues and things that you want to discuss. So can someone else report out?
Sure. I'll report out. I was in the public defender, defense attorney, DA attorney group. So we actually focused a little bit on how to create the opportunities for fun, adventure, and excitement, which you might be shocked that the lawyers would focus on that, but because of the challenges that being in a long-term custodial facility present and the public safety issues, we talked a little bit about how do we create those opportunities for the kids to find something that motivates them, makes them excited about learning something, trying to find a career path. So we talked about things, having facilities where they could play sports away from being in the institution, but a field or a gymnasium somewhere, creating culinary arts programs and different kinds of specific training programs that kids might be interested in, access to the trades, working with union folks, carpentry programs and things like that. And then the other thing we talked about was getting past the obstacle of access. How do we get the folks that can provide these kinds of programs into the facilities to work with the kids? What do we have to do with regard to background checks and scheduling and making them available in a way that works for the providers as well as the facility? So those were our thoughts.
Great. Did I hit everyone? I think there's Director Lucero, did you have a group?
I didn't. I joined Lauren.
Okay. So did I miss anyone? I think that hits it. So at this point, I think I'd like to thank Dr. Jeff Butts for having this conversation with us. As I mentioned earlier, his website and his CV will make you tired to read, but you will see that he should be a real resource to you on a myriad of issues that are pertinent to us. And so with that, I'd like to turn to Director Lucero to close us and maybe reference some future opportunities.
Sure. And first of all, thank you all for hanging in there with us and staying the entire time. This was a very important discussion for us to really just start imagining our youth as a resource. We will be giving these webinars the first Monday of every month from noon to 2, except for January, because that first Monday, I think, is either New Year's Eve or New Year's Day or something. On Monday, December 4th, Dr. Massa, our education expert, will be providing a webinar along with our Education Advisory Committee members and others on what high quality education for incarcerated youth looks like in the state of California. So I hope that you will join us. We will make sure and send that invitation out. And thank you all for all of the hard work that you do, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.